And for the poll, if your organization has had a grant before but you personally weren't involved with it, go ahead and say that you haven't done our grants before, because it's really going to be a workshop to go over the specifics for someone who has or hasn't gone through it. And if you haven't, that's perfectly fine. We will go through all the basics. I just like to get a sense of who's been here before and who hasn't. All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started and hope the others are going to join us. But hopefully everybody can hear me. Just a reminder, I am recording this session just so that you're aware of that. If you ask a question or anything, I just want you to be aware that I'm going to record it, and I am going to make this webinar available on our website so that people who couldn't participate today will be able to watch it at a later date. As you see on the screen, if you're having any problems, just send me a quick chat. You can also click the raise hand button if you have a question, and please feel free to interrupt me at any point. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jen Ruffner, and I am the Assistant Administrator of the Maryland Heritage Areas Program, and I'm pleased that you're all able to join us today. We have a lot of information to go over, but hopefully it won't be too painful. But just to give you a sense of where the discussion is going to go, we're going to talk a little bit about the Heritage Area Program itself. Then we will dive right into the project grants, which I'm sure is why you're all here. So into the nitty-gritty of who's eligible, the types of projects we fund, what we can and cannot pay for, the schedule for the grant program, and then tips for completing an application. I'll also touch on other programs and grants available through the Heritage Areas Program. So that's it in a nutshell. I've found in doing these past couple of weeks that this takes about an hour. But like I said, if I'm going too fast, interrupt. If you have questions or concerns and just need some more clarification, interrupt me as we go. I'd rather have you ask it while we're on the subject, and then I can address it as best I can. In looking at the poll results, it looks like a good number of you have received a Heritage Area grant in the past, but looks like about 30% of you have not, which is great. We have, as I said, we'll go into the basics. And it looks like we've got folks from a number of different heritage areas. So hopefully that means that you're familiar with the program, but if not, just as a refresher, this is the definition of a heritage area, and this is our official definition, and I've highlighted sort of the key elements of the definition. So really what the Heritage Areas Program is about is heritage tourism and economic development through heritage tourism. But we focus on history, cultural traditions, natural resources, all of those things that get rolled into that heritage word. And we really focus on partnerships in creating place-based experiences, authentic place-based experiences. And you who are at the site and at the resources in the heritage areas are the ones who create those place-based experiences. So that's why this grants program is so important. Heritage areas, there are 12 certified heritage areas and 1 recognized heritage area in the state of Maryland. These are locally designated heritage areas. They're certified at the state level. And this is sort of the baseline requirement of our grants program. You must be located within a certified heritage area. So unfortunately, that means if you are in Baltimore or Howard County, where we only have a recognized heritage area, the Tapsco Heritage Greenway, you are not eligible for heritage area grants until that heritage area becomes certified. But those of you who are located in a heritage area, it's important to remember that the project must be located within the boundaries of a certified heritage area. So even if your organization may not be located within the heritage area, if the project you were doing is located in the heritage area, you would be eligible for the grants. You hear us talk about MHAA. This is the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, and this is the independent state government entity that staffs the program and oversees the program, and it's staffed by the Maryland Heritage Historical Trust. And the trust staff are in the form of Richard Hughes, the administrator, and myself. I'm the assistant administrator. So the Heritage Areas Authority is a 19-member body, and it includes representatives from 9 state agencies, and our chair is Matt Power, who is the current Deputy Secretary of the Department of Planning. And the program receives up to $3 million annually. And the up to is important because that is the maximum amount we can receive, but that also means that we could receive less than that. Right now, we are in the governor's budget for the full $3 million this year, but obviously the budget has not been finalized, so that can always change. So, launching right into the grants. All of these types of organizations are eligible for Heritage Area grants. Nonprofits, local jurisdictions, state agencies, or federal agencies. And we're somewhat unusual in that we can give grants to other state agencies or to federal agencies. And we have 3 primary types of projects that we can fund: non-capital, capital, and programming. And I'll go into detail on all 3 of those in the next few slides. And I do just want to point out that the images that you're seeing in the slideshow are all grant-funded projects through the Heritage Areas program. The image on this page is the James Webb Cabin, and that's a restoration project that we're working on, and that was funded with Heritage Area funds. It was a capital project. So non-capital project grants. These are a broad range of activities, whether it's planning, design, interpretation. This can be museum exhibits, brochure creation, walking tour creation. Essentially, if it's not an event and it's not a bricks and mortar kind of project, it's a non-capital project. So pretty much anything that you can think of that isn't an event or a capital project would fall into this category. If you have a non-capital project, you can apply for up to $50,000. The program does require a one-for-one or dollar-for-dollar match, and we'll talk about match a little bit further along. But the guidelines are the same for any project type, that one-to-one match, and we do require that 75% of the match is cash. Now, if you got the email that I sent before the webinar, you should have a copy of our grant instructions. So if you want to follow along in those instructions, the page numbers in red allow you to do that. And I will be, at the end of the webinar, sending you a PDF of this PowerPoint. So don't feel like you need to scribble down all of this information. You will get this in the form of a PDF. Any questions on non-capital project grants? And remember, if you have a question, you can click the raise hand button, or you can just type a question into chat and I'll answer it as I go. Okay. The next type of project grant that we give is a programming grant. And these are events, generally one-off or short-term runs of events. This can be a seminar, a workshop, a performance, a reenactment, a commemoration, but it is an event, so it's a limited time only activity. The image that you see is actually a project we funded a few years ago called Project Runaway, and this was done by Historic Annapolis. And they actually held a series of performances of living history characters based on individuals who were described in runaway ads in Maryland newspapers. So whether they were indentured servants or escaped slaves, they took the descriptions of the people in those ads and created these living history characters into these performances, and it was really a wonderful experience. So that's a good example of a programming grant. As with the non-capital, the maximum you can apply for is $50,000, one-to-one match, as with all our grants. Questions on programming grants? Okay. And then the third primary type of project is a capital project, and this is the bricks and mortar, whether it is acquisition of property, rehabilitation of a structure. It can also include pre-development costs. So if you are building a new building and you need funds to pay an architect to draw up the plans, that also qualifies as capital funding. The primary criteria for a capital project is that you must meet the targeted investment criteria. Now, you may be new to this process, but if you have been with the grants program in the past, you will recall that we used to have something called a target investment zone. The target investment zones have gone away. We are no longer limiting capital grants to a single small portion or subset of the heritage area. Instead, what we are asking is that your capital project meets these targeted investment criteria. And you should have, on the email that I sent you, received a copy of the new target investment policy. And that really spells out what information you need for that. But essentially what it comes down to is that there are 2 required and then 4 additional criteria that you need to meet. The 2 required, you must fulfill the priorities of your certified heritage area, and the project must leverage investment and facilitate economic development. So those 2 you must meet. Your capital project must meet those 2. In addition, you must meet one of the following 4. Overlap with existing local, state, or federal designations. So that could be a scenic byway designation, an arts and entertainment district designation, a Main Street designation. There are many different kinds of designations, so your project should overlap with one of those, or contribute to initiatives supported by significant public investment, or be part of a concentration of heritage resources, or be a catalyst for future investment. So you need to meet at least one of those 4. It is in your benefit to meet more than one of those 4, because the more you meet, the stronger your grant application will be. So when you are completing your project narrative, you'll be asked questions about each of those items, and the more of those that you can address with your project, the stronger your application will be. Capital projects, you can apply for up to $100,000, but the same one-to-one match is still in place, 75% cash. The capital project money also comes with some additional requirements. If you have a historic property, you may be required to donate an easement or modify an existing easement on that property. An easement this is a preservation easement, and it is a transfer of development rights to the Maryland Historical Trust, and it is in perpetuity. So this is a pretty big deal, and it's something that you need to be aware of up front, because we would hate for you to go through the process of applying for the grant only to have to turn it down because you're not able to donate an easement. So make sure that that is part of your conversation with your governing agency or board, so that they are on board, and we actually require that you submit with your application a letter of willingness to donate the easement if it is required. Now, not every structure requires an easement, but many of them, particularly the historic ones, do. So again, make sure that you're aware of the ramifications of that. If an easement is not required on the property, the project will still need to be reviewed through our compliance section at Maryland Historical Trust, and this is part of what is sometimes known as Section 106 review. And what this is a process where we review projects that involve state or federal involvement, whether it's money or licensing, and in this case, obviously, the grant is money. And the goal is to make sure that there are no adverse effects on historic resources. So again, both of those processes may require you to modify your project so that it meets the requirements of the Maryland Historical Trust. One nice thing about the capital program is that the property does not have to be a historic property. So this could be if you are building a new visitor center, or you're taking a more modern building and turning it into a museum. Those are eligible for capital expenditures as well. Any questions on the capital projects? Okay. In addition to our 3 primary project areas, we also have 3 subcategories: education, archaeology, and natural resources. And these can be any of the 3 main types of projects. They can be events, they can be exhibits, they can be construction, but they can all, if they fall into one of these 3 categories, we do have a little bit of additional information that we need you to complete in your application. And there is an addendum form in each of these areas that you need to complete if your project falls within those categories. For pre-K through 12 education project grants, these can be a variety of different things. They can be curriculum development, teacher training, implementation of a curriculum, whether it is a development of a product at your site or development of something like a traveling trunk program that goes into the schools, or if it's some sort of programming activity that encourages school groups to visit your site. All of those fall into the education category. And the number one thing you need to keep in mind with education projects is that the projects must involve the local school districts, whether it's the Department of Education at the state level or your local school system, preferably both. We want to see that you are working closely with your local educators to ensure that the project is something that they need and is something that will fit in with the school system and their curriculum. Because the thing we don't want is for state funds to support a project that then the school system says, no, we're not going to use this because it doesn't meet our needs. So it's really critical if you're thinking about an education program that you involve your local schools, involve the teachers from the start. You should include letters of support from them in your application so that we see that you have that buy-in. The next subcategory is archaeology. Again, there are a lot of different kinds of projects that could fall into this category, whether it is protection of a site, public interpretation of archaeological resources, acquisition of land, programming. Any of those could fall into this category, but all of them must conform to the standards for archaeological investigation in Maryland. And archaeology for research sake alone is not going to work for this program because, again, as I said at the beginning, what we're looking for are heritage tourism projects. So if you are doing an archaeological dig and you want to fund it with grant funds, the key is to demonstrate what the end product of that research will be. So a good example of that is at Historic London Town, where they have done a number of archaeological digs which have then been used to reconstruct lost buildings in London Town. So something like that, it's research, but you're demonstrating what the heritage tourism component of it will be at the end. The third type are natural resource projects. And again, a wide variety of things could fall into it, whether it's trails, restoration of landscapes, educational programming, interpretive signage. You can even get funds to solve an environmental issue that's affecting heritage tourism. So a lot falls into this. And again, it's just a matter of completing that additional addendum of information in your application process. Any questions on those three subtypes? All right, moving quickly along, and do interrupt me if you do have questions. Those of you who have applied for grants in the past know that we every year have funding priorities, and you will recognize that these funding priorities for 2014 are almost exactly the same as they have been in previous years. These have been the same for several years now because these are long commemorations. So we are once again focusing on the bicentennial of the War of 1812, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but you'll note that we have also added the sesquicentennial of emancipation in Maryland to the list. Now, what this means, if you have a project that falls into one of these three categories, that's great. You get a few extra points in the review process. But if your project does not fall into one of these categories, that's fine as well. That does not mean it won't get funded. It just means that we are trying to prioritize these because they are of limited time significance while we are in the midst of these commemorations. So it's a good thing to mention if your project does tie into one of these, but it has to be a pretty significant tie-in. The reviewers are pretty savvy, and if you simply call your project the War of 1812 exhibit, but it doesn't appear to actually have anything to do with the War of 1812, they're going to realize that and you won't get the extra points. So make sure that it actually is a significant role that these topics play in your project. Any questions on the funding priorities? The most important thing, regardless of what type of project you're coming in for, the most important thing to remember is that whatever your project is, it needs to tie in with your heritage area's goals and objectives. Each heritage area, as I said at the beginning, is locally designated. And each heritage area has its own set of goals, objectives, strategies, priorities. So it's important that your project fits in with your local heritage area's priorities. And the way you can figure that out is by looking at their management plan or one of their other planning documents. They have just completed a 5-year plan, which includes a capital project appendix, and they also have annual work plans. So ideally, your project will be listed in one of those documents. If the specific project is not listed, you should be able to demonstrate how your project ties in with those goals and objectives. So if, for example, you are doing a project where you're going to create an exhibit on African American history in your area, and the specific exhibit isn't mentioned in your Heritage Areas Management Plan, but they have indicated that they have a priority to further knowledge about African American heritage in the heritage area. You would then cite that goal as linking to your project, and that's how you connect with the goals of your heritage area. And you actually want to get very specific in the application when you're writing your project narrative. Give us the page number, give us a quote from one of those planning documents so we know exactly how it's referenced. You also want to be sure that it is the project that you're talking about and not just your organization. And that's an important piece as well, because your organization may be mentioned a lot of times in the management plan. They have lists of all the different organizations that are in the heritage area. But what we want to see is the specific project and how that ties in with the heritage area goals and objectives. And Lynette has a question about small capital grant fund. And I believe, Lynette, you are in Baltimore, and that's actually the Baltimore mini grant program. And so that is a different program, and each mini grant program is unique to the heritage area that puts it on. And I'll talk a little bit more about the mini grants at the end. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Let's talk a little bit about what we can't pay for. First of all, heritage area funds are state funds. So that means that you can't use other state funds as match for a heritage area grant. So, for example, if you get a grant from the African American Heritage Preservation Capital Fund, you cannot match that to a heritage area grant. But if you do get a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, that's federal funds and can be used as match. And we'll talk a little bit more about match in a few slides. Things we can't pay for. We can't pay for overhead fees for your organization. So that's things like rent and utilities and your electric bill and those day-to-day costs that are just there to keep your organization operating. We also can't pay staff salaries for the applicant. So if you have staff working on the project, we can't use the grant funds to cover that cost, but you can use those staff salaries as part, but not all, of your matching funds, and it actually counts as cash match. That said, we don't want all of your cash match and all of your match to be staff time. So we try and keep it at about 35%, so about a third of your match is staff salaries. But again, it's okay to use that as long as it is work on the project. We are, however, able to pay for consultant fees. So what that means is if you are partnering with another organization and that organization is going to be using their staff to do some of the work, they would be considered a consultant to you. So we could pay for their salaries, but we can't pay for your staff salaries. The third thing we can't pay for project marketing. But as with the staff, it is okay to use that as part of your match, and in fact is encouraged, because we do want to see that you are aware of how you're going to get the word out about this great new project that we're funding. So we can't pay for it ourselves, but you can use that as part of your cash or in-kind match, depending on the form that it takes. Any questions on non-eligible expenses? Okay. A little bit more about matching funds. As I said, we do have a 1-to-1 or 100% match. So for every dollar of grant funds that you receive, you must contribute a dollar of applicant support that is non-state support, whether it is cash or in kind. Match cannot be spent outside the grant period. So what that means is if you are working on the project now, anything that you were doing now up until the point of the grant award is not eligible. So this is a really important point to think about as you're planning your project. The work on the project must be restricted to the grant period. And the grant period begins the day the grant is awarded, and that is a day in July. So that would be the first day that you could spend grant funds and the first day you can spend matching funds. So don't think that if you've got expenditures that you're making right now, you can use those as match. Plan accordingly. As I've said numerous times, cash match must be at least 75% of your required match. And that can be cash expenditures, support from non-state grants or loans, or staff salary, but again, no more than about a third of your match. And it has to be for work on the project. No more than 25% of the match can be in kind. And in kind can be a number of different things. It can be volunteer time spent working on the project. It can be donated professional services. It can be donated materials. It can also be if you have someone who is going to do some work for you and they are doing it at a reduced rate because they like your organization, because you're a nonprofit. They say, you know what, normally this is $500, but for this project I'm going to do it for $250. The difference, that $250 difference, that would be part of your in-kind match. So keep that in mind as well. In terms of volunteer time, there is a standard rate that we calculate volunteer time at. In the grant instructions, there is a website link to a site called Independent Sector. On that page, you'll see at the top of the page there is a national rate, and then if you scroll down, there's state-by-state rates, and we actually use the state rate for Maryland because it's a little bit higher than the national rate. So right now it's about $22.70 some, I believe. That is the rate that you value volunteer time at. The only exception to that is if you have a professional and they are donating their professional services. So if you have an architect and they are donating their time to do architectural drawings for you, that time can be billed at their professional rate. If, however, they are an architect, but they are simply helping to hand out brochures or serve as a docent or work at an event, then you use the lower rate, the $22.70 and odd cents rate, because they aren't donating their time in their professional capacity. In addition to the required match, we also ask you to provide us with additional grantee contribution or overmatch. What this is, we understand that most projects are going to cost more to complete than simply the amount that you're requesting is your grant plus your required matching funds. A lot of projects cost more than that. So what we want to know is we want to see the full cost of the project. And this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it allows us to demonstrate how much non-state funding is being leveraged with the state grants. And that's always a good figure to show the value of the program. In addition, it allows us to see what the project is actually going to cost so that we know that you are aware what it's going to cost, and also to help us as we work with other grantees who come in with similar projects, because we do see the same types of projects. So if we have a realistic idea of what it actually takes to do a project, then we are able to better advise subsequent grantees. Any questions on the matching funds? One of the key things, and this is a relatively new requirement of the program, we need to demonstrate that your cash match at a minimum, preferably all of your match, is in hand or firmly committed at the time of grant award. And what that means is that we need documentation that you have a firm match. Now, we understand you're going to be writing an application in the next month or so. You may not have all of your match lined up at that point. So what we've done is we are asking that you provide us with that documentation of match no later than June 15th, 2013. So that gives us time to look at that before the grants are awarded. It is absolutely critical that you provide this documentation, because if you haven't provided documentation of firm match and your grant is recommended for award, your award will be reduced to the amount that you have firm match for. So it is critical that you provide that documentation. And documentation can take a number of different forms. If you have cash reserves that you're going to be relying on, you can send us a copy of your bank statement that shows that balance along with a letter of commitment from your organization. Because obviously we want to know that not only do you have the cash in the bank now, but you are committing to spend it on this project. Documentation can be an award letter from a non-state grant. So you've applied to the NEH and they've given you the award letter, but you just don't have the check yet. That's fine. You've got the commitment from them to provide those funding. Additionally, you can have a letter of commitment if you've got a donor who's going to be giving you money, if you have someone who's going to donate services or staff or materials, give us a letter showing that commitment. If it's your staff time, it should be a letter from your organization documenting who you're committing, what their hourly rates are, and how much time they're committed to this project. If you work for a government agency, non-state obviously, you can provide us with a copy of a budget that includes the project as a budgeted line item for the agency. One other thing you can do, if you have a primary source of match that you're hoping to use, but it will not be finalized by that June 15th deadline, you can provide us with a backup source of funds. So if you've applied for a grant, but it has not yet been awarded and it won't be awarded by June 15th, tell us, we have applied for this grant, it will be awarded on this date. If that grant falls through, this is our backup source, whether it is cash reserves or an endowment fund that you can tap into. Whatever that backup source is, provide us a documentation of that, a bank balance, a letter of commitment, same as the previous list. So you can do that if your primary source is not going to be finalized by June 15th. Any questions on match documentation? Okay. So let's talk about schedule a little bit. Right now, we're coming up on intent to apply deadlines for many of the local heritage areas. What this is generally a one-page form that just allows us to get a sense of the types of projects and the amount of funds that are going to be requested. This is a very easy form to fill out. Each heritage area has their own form and their own deadlines, and I'll show you those dates on the next slide. It is not a requirement of the grant program, but it is strongly recommended that you complete this and submit it to your local heritage area. I know some of the heritage areas, the deadlines have passed, but there's still time to submit that, and I do encourage you to do that because it allows us to understand what's coming in, and it allows your local heritage area to follow up with you and work with you to make sure that you've got a strong project before you go through the entire application process. So make sure that you submit those. If any of you are thinking about a multi-heritage area grant, and this would be a project that goes beyond the boundaries of a single heritage area, you have a completely different schedule to follow. And if you fall into that category, please follow up with me. Your applications are due on February 15th, and they are due to the state. And that is the only time an application will be submitted at the state level. Everyone else, you are going to be submitting your applications directly to your local heritage area. Generally, the deadlines are in late February, early March. Again, I've got those on the next slide, but it is very important that you submit to your local heritage area. If you send it to the state, it will be disqualified. Once you've submitted those, your local heritage area is going to review all the applications they receive, and they are going to rank all the applications they receive. They then provide that ranking and all of the applications to the state on April 5th. After that, staff review the applications, and our technical advisory committee reviews the applications. And then the Technical Advisory Committee makes recommendations to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, who will vote on the grant awards at their July meeting. And that meeting date is the first day that you can begin work on the project if you're successful. That is the start of the grant period. But unfortunately, we are a bureaucracy, and we're not always able to get the paperwork turned around as quickly as we like. So while you may have received a grant award in July, you may not have an executed grant agreement until close to the end of the year, which means that you probably won't have your first disbursement check until early in the new year. And that is a very important point to remember as you're thinking about your timeline, when the work is going to happen, and how your budget's going to play out, because you will have probably a good 6 months where you can be working on the project, but you may not have received your state funds until January of 2014. And the way we generally disperse funds, just again to keep in mind when you are creating your budget and creating your timeline, we generally give an initial disbursement once the grant is executed. That's usually 25% of the project. 50% comes at a midpoint, generally tied to a deliverable in your project and with a mid-project report. And then your final 25% will not be issued until your project is complete and you have submitted your final report. So what that means is the first 2 payments can be either reimbursable or can be advances depending on the timing of your project, but your last 25% will always be reimbursable because that has to be after the project is completed and after you have completed your final report. So as I promised, here are the deadlines for your heritage areas. If the exact dates aren't on here, you will need to contact your heritage area directly. As you can see, some of the intent to apply dates have passed, but again, that's not a requirement to apply, and I would recommend that you still submit one even though you've missed the deadline, because there were a few that were on Friday. You will also note that some of the heritage areas actually allow you to submit a draft. Some may even require it. So you'll want to follow up with them to find out what the steps are for submitting your application. And if they do allow for submittal of a draft, I highly encourage you to do that. They will give you valuable feedback on your application that can help you in the end. And again, I will send this PDF to you so you'll have these dates in front of you. Let's talk a little bit about submitting the application. Unfortunately, we are still very much tied to paper, although we hope to change that in the near future. And what that means is that we need lots of paper copies of your application to give to all the different reviewers. So we ask for 2 sets of every document that we request in the application, and you'll see there's an itemized list of everything you need to include. We need 2 full sets. Please make sure they're collated. Make sure each set is either clipped together or rubber banded together if it's really thick. However it is, make sure that each set is its own set that we can pick up and take away. And make sure that one of those sets has your original signatures. And it's really important that you mark that as original, particularly if the person signing your application signs in black ink. It makes it hard for us to tell if it's a photocopy or an original. So just put a sticky note on the front that says original, and that way we'll know that's your original, and then 1 additional full set of all of those items. In addition to the 2 full sets, we need 12 sets of the core elements: your cover sheet, your narrative, your budget, resumes of people involved on the project, and if you're a matching proof of your matching funds, and then if it's a capital project, any of those deliverables: photographs, an easement letter, maps, site plans, drawings, appraisals. These sets can be photocopies. You can double-side them, make sure they're stapled. Each one is stapled, and compiled so that we can hand those directly to our reviewers. Please make sure they're collated. Don't just hand us a pile of paper. Make sure they're stapled or clipped together, each one, so that we can pull them apart. In addition to the in addition to the paper copies, we need electronic copies. And we need 3 separate copies, whether it's on CDs, DVDs, or even USB drives. If you have a bunch of freebie USB drives that you want to use, that's fine too. And what we need on there is a copy of the cover sheet, the narrative, the budget, and any photographs that you're including in the project if they're digital photographs. And if you can't tell from this slide, please, please, please do not send us PDFs. The reason we're asking for these digital copies is so that we can extract information from your application to include in our documents for our reviewers, and if you are successful, also in our applications. And we can't do that if you put it in PDF format. So it is absolutely crucial that you have it in a Word readable format, or in the case of the budget, an Excel readable format. No PDFs. Any questions on the submission format? All right, some tips for getting our grants. You're here on this webinar, so you're already off to a good start. It's very important that you don't wait until the last minute because there are a lot of different moving parts to these applications. What I would recommend is that you read through all of the instructions and look over the application form today. Make a list of all the elements that you're going to need to pull together. If you have folks you can delegate to, determine who's going to do what, and give them deadlines. And make those deadlines at least a week or 2 before the actual deadline so that you have plenty of time in case something goes wrong. This is particularly important for your letters of support. We do require letters of support from your elected officials. It's a good idea to start getting those now. I recommend drafting a letter that you send to the elected official, and then they usually can send those back pretty quickly, but you don't want that to fall through the cracks because that is a requirement of the application. Please, as you go, ask questions whenever you have them. You can ask me, you can ask Richard Hughes, you can talk to your local Heritage Area Director or staff. We are all happy to help you. You know, if you're having trouble figuring out the angle for your project, or if you're not sure if it's something that's eligible, or you just don't understand the instructions, please give us a call. Let us know. We are happy to help. We would much rather you ask the question up front than go through the whole process and find out that you misunderstood something. Once you have your application put together, make sure that you do spell check, that you do grammar check, that you do math check, and make sure you don't just rely on your computer to do those things for you, because we all know that spell check sometimes misses some things. Our reviewers are reading many, many applications. And if you want your application to stand out in a good way, you want to make sure that your spelling's right, that your budget adds up, because if not, that really is a mark against you, because it shows that you don't have the time or the capacity to review your documents and really make sure that they are in tip-top shape. So please make sure you do that. And one of the best ways to do that is to have someone who is not familiar with your project read your application. Not only will a fresh set of eyes catch those mistakes that you may have missed because you're going cross-eyed from looking at this for so long, but the other benefit of this is that they will hopefully be able to help you with the clarity of your application. You are intimately familiar with your project. You've probably been working on it for months, if not years. You know all the little ins and outs, and it's what you're obsessed with. You're thinking about this all the time. You may be too close to it to see if it's not making sense, but you have to assume that the reviewers are not going to be familiar with your project. So you want it to be as clear and concise as possible. So having a fresh set of eyes to look at it is helpful in that regard as well, because they can take a look at it and say, you know what, I don't quite understand why this is important, or I don't quite understand how you get from point A to point B here. This doesn't make sense to me. So that will really help make sure that you have a really clear application. Make sure that you include detail, particularly with your budgets. We want to know where the information came from. We want to know how you got those numbers. But that said, we don't want detail just for detail's sake. So more is not better. Detail is good, but don't write just to fill up space. And if it says that something should only be 250 words, please make sure it's no more than 250 words. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but again, you need to convey the heritage tourism value of your project. This is what the whole program hinges on, and your project must tie into heritage tourism in some way, shape, or form. And so you need to convey that, particularly if it's not immediately obvious what that linkage is. As I said earlier, it's also important to identify how you connect with the management plan or other planning documents of your local heritage area, and cite those page numbers, cite that reference text for where your project is listed, or if the specific project is not listed, the elements of the plan that your project links to. Almost all, if not all, of the heritage areas have their management plans on their websites. And what I recommend is that you pull that up. Don't print them. These are huge documents. Your printer will not be happy with you if you try and print it out. What I recommend is do a find command for the name of your organization, and that could allow you to find whether or not your organization is listed or if a particular project is there. If you're having trouble finding it, or if you're having trouble making that linkage, again, talk to your local heritage area director or their staff. They can help you figure out how you link to their priorities. As we talked about already, strong match is really important. In-hand and committed match is very, very important. And if you are able to show more than a one-to-one match, so again, that overmatch, that also makes it a stronger project, because it shows that not only are you getting grant funds and matching it with your own, but in addition to that, there are more funds that you will be bringing into the project. And finally, summary scope of work, timetable, and budget must all relate. And this I actually have a little example to show, because this is one of our biggest problems on our application. So as you're looking at the application, on the cover sheet, you will see that there is a section that asks for a summary scope of work of your project, no more than 250 words. And this is where you really distill your project down into its essence. In 250 words or less, you need to describe exactly what you're going to do in the project. And this is actually the basis for the grant agreement if you are successful in your application. So it needs to include everything, and our legal team will look at this and say, you know what, this isn't in their scope of work, so is it really part of the project? So you need to make sure that all the elements are there, and then you need to make sure that your timetable and budget align with that scope of work, because we want to see what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how much it's going to cost. So in this example, we have a museum, and they are doing an interpretive exhibit. They are hiring consultants that are going to design and fabricate the exhibit, and then they are designing and printing brochures. So if you look at the timetable, you see when they hire the consultant, you see when they finish up that design, you see when they start fabrication and when they end, when the exhibit is finalized. You've got the brochure design and you've got the brochure printed. So they've got all those steps in the timeline. And in the budget, again, you see all the pieces. So there's the exhibit design consultant, there's the cost of fabricating the exhibit, there's the cost of the brochure design, and there's the cost of printing. And you'll see for the consultant and the printing, they've given us the details, so we know where those numbers came from. It's not just a number pulled out of the blue. It's actually based on an estimate of cost, whether it's a dollar amount per hour and the number of hours, or if it's a per piece price for the brochures. Anywhere that you can provide that kind of detail in the budget, the better. Any questions on these three pieces? All right, and finally, in terms of tips, in your instructions in Appendix A, you will see that there is a list of selection criteria. And these are the elements that the reviewers will be looking at when they are reading your application. And they will be scoring your applications based on these criteria. Knowing that, it's important for your narrative to address these items. Because if you don't address them, then the reviewer can't tell necessarily how your project meets the criteria. So again, this is things like how you fit in with the plans of the heritage area. Give us that page number, give us that quote from the management plan, whatever it is, make sure you make that clear. The reviewer will be looking at how the project is designed. So do you know what it's going to take to get this project done? Is it organized in an intelligent way that will be successful? And keep in mind that the reviewers have seen lots of projects over the years, so they're pretty familiar with what it takes to do an exhibit or a brochure or a trail. So they want to see that you understand what it's going to take as well. They're going to want to look at the budget. Are the costs reasonable? Have you taken into account all potential costs? What does your match look like? Is there overmatch? Is your match firm? All of those items they're going to look at. Urgency is a good one, and this can mean a couple different things. Urgency can mean the derecho came through and pulled a bunch of roof tiles off, and we are now getting rain in, and we have to get this fixed immediately before it damages the building. That's one type of urgency. Another type of urgency is we are going to be celebrating an anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary this year. It's the 100th anniversary this year. If we don't do this year, we lose that opportunity. That's another kind of urgency. If there's any kind of urgency like that, that there is a timeliness to the project, make sure you convey that. Feasibility and readiness is another good one. And again, this is, the reviewers are looking to make sure that your organization is capable of doing this project and you are ready to do this project. So is it possible to accomplish your goals with the resources that you are providing? And is your organization ready to undertake that? Are you ready to go, or are there still a lot of unknown up in the air elements to the project? So make sure you're very clear about where things are in the process. The reviewers are going to look at impact, and this could be things like increased visitation at your site, a new resource that will draw a different type of visitor to the area, a project that will be a catalyst for additional projects. Those kind of things are impact, and you want to show what's going to be the long-term effects of your project. The reviewers also look at administrative capability of your organization. And again, this is, have you had grants in the past? Have you managed those grants effectively? Is your organization in a position to handle a large state grant? We also look at sustainability and preservation, and this includes not just whether or not you're preserving a historic structure, for example, but it can also be green elements to your project. So if it's a new construction, are you going for LEED certification? But it can also be small things. If you're doing a brochure, is it on recycled paper, and are you using soy ink? So those kind of elements to your project if they are applicable. We also look at whether or not your project coordinates with broader initiatives. And these could be the three priority areas that I mentioned before: 1812, Civil War, Tubman, Underground Railroad, Maryland Emancipation. Or there could be other initiatives, whether it is a byway initiative, whether it is the Washington-Rochambeau Trail. There are lots of different initiatives. If your project ties in with one of those, make sure you're clear about that in the application. And finally, if your capital project, again, going back to those targeted investment criteria, you're required to have the 2 plus 1 of the 4. If you can address more than one of the 4 optional, do so. That's really to your benefit. Some tips for specific types of projects. Capital grants, make sure you give us pictures. A picture speaks 1,000 words, and particularly with capital projects, it really helps the reviewers to see what you're talking about. If there is a damaged chimney, send us a picture of the chimney. If there is a new building that you want to put on a plot of land, give us an image of the plot of land, give us the building plans, and give us a map so we know where we're talking about. If you're doing some kind of outdoor signage or trails, again, a map is really helpful. If you don't know exact locations for signs or trails, give us at least an approximate location. With these types of projects, it's also important to address maintenance. So if you are putting in some wayside signs, how will you handle it if they get damaged, if there's graffiti on them, if in 5 years they're worn out? What is the plan for maintenance? Who will be responsible for that? Again, if you're doing an educational project, make sure you've got that buy-in from the school system or your local school district. And if you're doing some kind of technology project, whether it is a website or a smartphone app, your application needs to answer questions about how long you anticipate that it will be online. Are there any ongoing maintenance fees? Are there hosting fees? And if so, who's going to pay for those? Things like information ownership. If you're doing a smartphone app that uses a proprietary system and you are putting all of your data in, what happens when the money goes away? Do you get to keep that app? Do you get to keep that data? So again, make sure your application addresses those because the reviewers want to see that you have thought about the project beyond the immediate scope of the grant. Very quickly, I just want to draw your attention to a few other benefits of the Heritage Areas program. If the grants don't look like they're a good fit for you or you're a business entity or an individual, we do have a loan program, generally for capital type projects. You must meet the targeted investment criteria just as you would with a capital grant. The loan can be used to pay for up to 50% of the project costs. That is dependent on the available funds. But again, business entities and individuals, in addition to governments and nonprofits, can apply for those. In addition, being located within the heritage area does come with some expansion of the Sustainable Communities Tax Credit Program. Structures that may not normally be eligible are potentially eligible in the Heritage Areas program. I will say that this is not my program, and I am not particularly well versed in this because it is quite a complex program. But if you think you have a project that might fall into this category, I encourage you to go to our website and talk to our tax credit staff. They will be happy to help you with this. As I mentioned earlier, most of the heritage areas, if not all, do have a mini grant program. In Baltimore, it is a little bit bigger. In Baltimore, there is a capital mini grant program. But the rest of the heritage areas have a non-capital mini grant program. Generally, they're between $2,500 and $5,000. And these are operated by the local heritage area. They all have different deadlines. They all have different award amounts. But if your project only requires a little bit of cash, this might be the way to go because it is a much more straightforward application process. So if you have a small project, be sure to contact your local heritage area for details on their program. And that is the end of my formal presentation. I am happy to answer any questions you might have. As I said, I will be sending you a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation. I will also be making it available online, and you'll be able to watch it again if you so choose. But I am happy to answer any questions now. If folks have thought of things, you can either send me a quick chat or click the raise hand button and I'll unmute you. And if you've gotten everything you need, feel free to log off at any point. I'm happy to answer questions though. Any questions from anyone? And you've got our contact information. Richard and I are both happy to answer questions if they come up later. And again, I do encourage you to contact your local heritage area as well, because it's important for you to communicate with them through this process as well. So I will hang out for a little bit. If anybody thinks of a question, I'm here. If not, thank you so much for participating, and have a good rest of the day. Okay. Gina or Valerie, any other questions?
On that by next Wednesday.
Okay. All right, folks, I'm not hearing any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you again for participating, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions.